Happy Friday.
Hey.
Yes. Oh man,
Hi,
I'm
Marcia.
so excited to see this crowd here. I'm Marcia Sear, and I'm the head of outreach programs and education. Okay, it's a new title. I work here at Northside. I've been with the library for about 10 years, but I only recently kind of took over programs and things like this for the library. So I was contacted by our guest today, Bill, and he said he was going to be in Kenosha for a kind of a short visit, long weekend, and he wanted the opportunity to give this amazing talk that he and his brothers have gone on a journey, which is what he's here to share. So I feel so fortunate that that we're even able to get this program and to share it with the community. Jason from Kenosha Community Media is here video recording it. So if you know people who were interested in this program but they weren't able to come because of the day and time, let them know that this video is going to be available. So with that said, I would like to just tell you about one more special event that's coming up next Saturday at Southwest Library. We're having the second annual Southport Literary Fair. We have 27 authors coming to the library. We're also going to have panels and hands-on activities. There's a brochure like this over on the side table. And then the Kenosha Public Library events calendar from September through December has also been published. There's copies of this. This is for all the branches, all ages programming. And of course, these programs are always free of charge. So now I would like to introduce our guest, Mr. Bill Hammond, here all the way from New Hampshire. Okay, I kept thinking Vermont in my head, but I'm like, no, New Hampshire, who has a special connection to Kenosha and is here to tell us his story of recreating his father's footsteps from the war. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Bill Hammond.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for having me here for this talk. On May 7th, 1945, the day of Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allies in World War II, a conscripted Polish farm worker in a little crossroads village in Germany approached a mess sergeant from the U.S.'s 142nd Regiment, Company K. The newly freed conscript heard that the mess sergeant from Chicago knew a little Polish, and he had a favor to ask. His son had been born 7 months earlier, and he wanted the boy baptized. He had been unable to do so for want of a Catholic priest. Though the mess sergeant didn't have an immediate solution, he did suggest going to the old man, a 30-year-old first lieutenant who by fate, training, and attrition had become company commander. On hearing the Polish family's dilemma and feeling jubilant about the end of the war in Europe, the company commander requisitioned 3 jeeps and headed with the family and some troops to the Catholic church he remembered passing 60 miles to the south, St. Laurentius Church in St. Mary's Parish in Hochspeyer, Germany. He volunteered to be the boy's godfather. The old man, my old man, my sister's old man, like many World War II soldiers, didn't talk much about the time as a soldier. And I understand his reluctance. Who wants to regularly revisit the most harrowing moments of our lives? But my dad did on occasion tell this story about the Polish boy and the Polish family. Perhaps to force a diversion from the disaster and starvation he had witnessed, and to grasp for a glimmer of hope. So for years, my siblings and I talked about honoring and thanking my late father by taking a trip to follow his footsteps in World War II. It was a pivotal time in his life, but one we knew just a little about. So 2 brothers and I made the excursion during 3 weeks last October, 2023. Today I'll talk about some of the highlights of our journey and what we discovered about our father. How many of you are connected with someone who fought in or were connected with World War II? See? And my dad and 4 of his brothers were all in World War II at the same time. So one of my reasons for giving this talk is not just to talk about my dad, who was he was mayor of Kenosha. He was the first mayor after the city manager system stopped from 1959 to 1968. But one reason I give this talk, besides honoring him, is for people to think, how might I replicate or do something similar to honor people that are important to you? Where might you go? It doesn't have to be World War II. It doesn't have to be a parent. It could be a child or someone else. So think about that too as you hear this talk. So I want to talk a little bit about our planning for this. Since we didn't know exactly what he did, and he never told us exactly what he did, but we heard him speak French every once in a while, and we heard him speak German every once in a while. So we knew that he had been these places. But at first, we only had the information from the Texas Military Museum on the 142nd Regiment and where the 142nd Regiment had gone. And so they had been left from New York Harbor and ended up in North Africa, where they finished up their training in Algeria, down here. And then they entered the war through Salerno, Italy, went up Italy, into France, and then over into Germany and down into Austria, and ended up in Austria. And he kept flipping back between Austria and Germany at the end of the war. So that was one of the sources of information. But the information about the 142nd Regiment is about the whole regiment. And there are a number of companies within the regiment, and they ended up going over to the war at different times. And so we had to start figuring out, or just guessing, where he would have been at any particular time. And then 5 months before we left, my sister Ruth found a trove of letters that my father had written to his mother during the war. And though he could never specify exactly where he was, he would say somewhere in Italy or somewhere in Germany, there were hints every once in a while about where he was. For example, he said, Mount Vesuvius erupted last night. And it was marvelous. And so we were able to look back at some of the geologic data, and Vesuvius erupted for a week and a half in March of 1944, and so we knew that's where he was. And so he couldn't have been with the advance group. He must have been in some of the replacement troops. So that's what we took a look at. And the last thing we looked at in order to find out where he was he got 2 Purple Hearts and 2 Silver Stars during the war. And when the Army talked about what he had done, they put dates and they put places. And so we were able to triangulate that information with what we already had and have a good sense of where he was. Here's an excerpt, for example, from letter number 6, where he talked about Vesuvius. March 19th, 1944, somewhere in Italy. Vesuvius was acting up last night, and we could see it for many miles. It looked like a huge bonfire on top of the mountain. So we were happy to have that information. So my 2 brothers and I, George and Jean, we flew into Naples and we rented a car and we worked our way down to Salerno. Does that remind you of anything? To me, it reminded me of Lake Michigan. I thought, oh my goodness, Dad came here and he felt comfortable right away. And then you turn around and it's all mountains. So it doesn't look like Kenosha on that side, but it looks like Kenosha on this side. when they first arrived and the landing, they didn't deal with battles, so they didn't have to work their way onto land and force their way onto land. They were uncontested at this point. And Dad wrote about this in letter number 7. Even before the battle started, Dad started writing about the impact of the war. And his letters started talking about the change in his psyche from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. He talked at the beginning of the war about, I wonder what's going to happen. People were coming off the front lines. We haven't been baptized yet, so I can tell that the people who've been fighting and we have very different perspectives on what's going on with this war so far. Here's an excerpt from letter number 7. This is April 9th, 1944, about 3 weeks after that last comment about Vesuvius. Somewhere in Italy. The Germans really used the scorched earth policy, and we don't do a bad job of ourselves of destroying buildings, etc. Where the Jerry gets firmly entrenched, Jerry being German, where the Jerry gets firmly entrenched, thank God that the war has never reached the U.S. It's a mess, and it leaves people in such a helpless condition. We see and hear plenty, but that will have to wait. Read the papers, but realize that it is written for the consumption of the public. War is not as glamorous as they'd have you believe, and it is not so widespread as it indicates. Fighting a war is a science, and science develops slowly. So a man is not always dodging shells, even though he's on the front lines. Life goes on merrily, a few blocks away. So they worked their way up Italy and ended up in Avellino. That was our next clue. We knew he was in Avellino because we have a photograph that on the back says Avellino, Italy. That was the photography studio that took it. In Avellino, Italy, they did fight. 1 in 8 died. So in Kenosha, what would that be? 10,000 people died? No, that's an extraordinary hit on a town. What we did, we figured if he got a photograph taken in Italy, maybe we could find the photography studio. So we went there. We didn't really think we were going to find it, but we thought this is a way of approaching it. So we just started talking with the locals there, and it was fascinating to talk with them about their perspective on the war, some of whom weren't born yet, right? We weren't born yet. There were very few that were born during the war. But what the long-term impact was for people. This was the picture from Avellino, May of 1944. And I'd like you to take a close look at that and just look at the face. What do you notice? What, somebody saying something? Yeah. Yeah, well, I came from that guy. Yeah. But notice, I'll put it up again later to show what I'm trying to get at. But when we went there, kids were outside making posters on the sidewalk about how to preserve bees. And
What age was your dad?
he was 29 and 30 years old during the war. So he went in as a 29-year-old non-commissioned officer. And by the end of the war was 30. So we went to Avellino, and then we kept going north. We went through Monte Cassino, where there was a big battle. In fact, the 142nd Regiment lost 50% of the people, 50% of the Americans that were there at that point died in that battle. My dad was in the second wave. The fighting paused at that point because they needed replacements. And so they waited for the replacements to come so they could keep moving forward. We kept going up and got to Nettuno, Italy, which is just south of Rome. And the memorial there is absolutely stunningly gorgeous. Not just the foliage, but this. And you see this when you see pictures of Normandy. This was happening in Italy as well. And as we went and continued on our trip to follow his footsteps, we found more and more of these cemeteries. So you realize, too, that some of these people who survived, like my father, were lucky, and he talked about that, too. So here, also from Italy, letter number 12. Behind the Germans only by a step. 6/28/44. So we're talking about, we were in April, so it's about 2 months later, somewhere in Italy. The Jerry myth is beginning to tumble. The only way we've been able to survive so far, the only way they have been able to survive so far is by robbing the populace where they are. They move into an area, clear all the Italians out of their houses, and take over. They kill all the food they want to eat, as well as pigs, cows, etc. Use anything inside or outside the house, such as cows, wagons, horses, etc., and don't care what happens to anything. From this standpoint, they are truly barbarians. Many times a German-occupied house will be included in our objective, and while they kill the chicken, pick it, and fry it, we arrive so soon after that we eat it. They had to take off in such a hurry that they leave the table set and we move right in and enjoy it. They aren't bad cooks either. I've had some of their coffee they had brewing and had to wait for it to cool off. So all of war is not too bad. There are compensations, but the big one will be when it quits and we can get back to somewhat of a normal life again. There will be many scars from this war. On human mentality, I mean. The physical disabilities are bad enough, but a person has to be rough and tough both physically and mentally to withstand the things he has to do and things he sees, or he'd miss the boat entirely. The Americans here are doing it, and well, with a few exceptions. I wouldn't say all are brave. Anybody who isn't scared is a fool. But we are all well trained and have confidence in our weapons, in ourselves, and in our pals to fight well. So a person sees very little outward fear, even when things get fairly rough. Everybody continues to do their job with an inconceivable calmness. I guess everybody figures that God will see to it that we'll get it if it's our turn, and if it isn't, we'll just have to carry on as best we can. From Italy, they went up through France, and it was a San Rafael beach landing in southern France near Nice, Marseille, between Nice and Marseille. That was not easy. That was not like Salerno. They were being fired upon as they were coming in. And the troops that my dad was working with were in a boat, and they were being brought in by a Navy guy. And the Navy guy said, "I'm not bringing you in any further." And my dad said, "Oh, yes, you are." These guys all had packs on. They weren't going to be dumped in 10 feet of water and have to get up to the shoreline. So eventually he convinced the guy to bring them up to the beach, and they fought strongly on that beach landing. And my brothers and I, just to commemorate, just dipped our fingers in the water there, as that's our next step, that's our next move. From San Rafael, down here with the beach landing, he worked his way up France here, and by the time November rolled around, the fighting was pretty intense. And the intensity was shown through his first Silver Star. before I read what the Silver Star citation says, I want to talk a little bit about what my brothers and I went through to get there. So we rented a car again in France and worked our way up through the mountains. And what we found out from the Silver Star citation was that Dad was in a pretty specific place November 9th and 10th. And we thought we could get pretty close to what that place was, but we weren't sure exactly where it was. And so we knew it was in this national forest in France, what is now a national forest. And we got to a rotary, and we were driving around the rotary, and we thought, yeah, the first exit off the rotary is probably the one. And so we went off the first one, and as soon as we got about 100 yards off, Google told us, yeah, you're going the wrong direction. So we turned around and went back to the rotary and went off the second one. And as soon as we went about 100 yards, Google would say, you're off. We went off the third, we went off the fourth. We went off every exit from this rotary, and it said we were going in the wrong direction on every single exit, but we were on the right rotary. And so we were trying to figure out what we would do. And it turned out we saw this little alley, this Kenosha, the back alleys? It was nothing bigger than one of those back alleys. And we said, why don't we go up that alley? And my brother said, no way, there's no way that's the way. So we went up that alley. Google's okay with it. Winding roads, 1.5 lanes. You couldn't pass another car on these things. The houses weren't tall, but they were right up on the roads. No matter where we went, Google was okay with it. And you got to listen to Google, right? So we got to the top, and it was the introduction and the beginning of this national forest. So we ended up in the right place, and we went down this road, and the citation talked about a farmhouse that they went to. So that was our destination. We were going to try to get to this farmhouse if we could. And we wondered, if we see 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 farmhouses, maybe we can get a little sense of what the terrain was like, because it talks about the terrain a little bit. So we're traveling in this national forest on a 1.5 lane place. We would have had to pull over if anybody came in the direction. Nobody came in the other direction. We were traveling for miles, and we didn't see a single house. We didn't see a single farm. We thought, maybe everything that was there at that time is just gone. So we'll just, stop at some point. And we get to the crest of a hill, and we see a farmhouse. And it's the only farmhouse in this forest. We had gone through WWII, where there was another cemetery, and we'd gone through Remiremont, where it talks about the Jews that were deported from Remiremont, France to Auschwitz, and they had a nice memorial for that there. So we'd gone through that, and then we got to this farmhouse. There's Jean, there's George. I'm right here. Taking the picture. We aren't certain that was the farmhouse, but we think it was because it was the only farmhouse. And we looked up to the side here, and there was the rugged terrain. So here's the first Silver Star. Subject, Award of the Silver Star, First Lieutenant Eugene R. Hammond. You are awarded a Silver Star for gallantry in action. Eugene Hammond, First Lieutenant, 142nd Regiment, for gallantry in action on the 9th and 10th of November, 1944 in France. While returning to friendly lines, a combat patrol consisting of 2 platoons was fired on by 5 enemy machine guns, and the leader was wounded. Lieutenant Hammond assumed command and led an attack on the enemy positions. He destroyed a machine gun and machine pistol emplacement with 2 hand grenades. Efforts to penetrate the German lines failed, darkness fell, and because the supply of ammunition was low, the situation was critical. Lieutenant Hammond then led the group over 2,000 yards of rugged terrain through a blinding snowstorm to the shelter of a farm, maybe that farmhouse, from which contact was made with friendly forces. By his courage and outstanding leadership, Lieutenant Hammond successfully destroyed a hostile machine gun emplacement, and led a large patrol safely back from behind enemy lines. What I haven't told you yet is that we have letters from Italy and we have letters from Germany, but we have no letters from France. And we don't know if that's because those were lost or because the fighting was so intense that he did not write when he was in France. And then we got into Germany. Germany, Kaiserslautern. It was the locale of Dad's second Silver Star. It wasn't long after. And the following day, he wrote a letter to his sister Mary. But first, I'd like to read the second Silver Star, which is called an oak leaf cluster. Eugene R. Hammond, 1st Lieutenant, 142nd Infantry Regiment, for gallantry in action on the 20th of March, 1945 in Germany. As the men of Company K neared the crest of a hill, they were subjected to intense machine gun and rifle fire from the trenches and pillboxes 25 yards away. I mean, what we were trying to do was imagine what this was like, to be in a situation where the machine gun fire is not much farther than the end of this room. Lieutenant Hammond, company commander, immediately exposed himself to the hostile fire to direct his men in clearing the enemy positions. During the fierce fight which ensued, he was painfully wounded by a fragment of a hand grenade. Refusing medical aid, he courageously moved among his men, encouraging them and directing their fire until the hill was taken. Although suffering from a concussion, he determinedly supervised the defensive deployment of his men. As a result of the courage and leadership of Lieutenant Hammond, the company seized and held the objective. So the next day, he wrote this letter to his sister Mary, whose son, by the way, is right here, Jim. 3/21/45. You remember that was 3/20/45, somewhere in Germany. Constant faith in God, patience, and continued hope that this will soon be over will make all of us appreciative of God's favors. I know that my sister will never despair and that life will be good to you. I know that all the boys, when they come home, will have profited by their experience and that family life will be more precious than ever before. Happy birthday, sis. So we figured, you remember the introduction to this talk, we figured since we were in Germany, let's try to find this church where Dad brought this Polish boy to get baptized. And we had heard that it was in Hawkspire. We heard that it was St. Mary's Church. And so we went to Hawkspire, and there was no St. Mary's Church in Hawkspire. In fact, people could not find another Catholic church besides St. Laurentius Church. And so we thought, maybe it's St. Laurentius Church. So we went there, and on the front of it was St. Laurentius Church, St. Mary's Parish. We thought, beautiful, we'll take that. So we thought this would be a nice place. And so we were photographing the outside, and these two little boys were biking around the church, and they saw us looking around, and eventually they stopped us and said, "What are you doing here?" And they said it in English. And we said, well, we explained the story. This church was important in the history of our family. And the one kid said he was from Miami. His dad was from Miami. And he was living in Germany. And the other kid had just come over from Ukraine and was settling in Germany for now. And he said, well, you know, if you want to go in the church, you can go in the church. The guy who opens the church is sitting over there at the table having his noon beer with his friends. This was the kind of serendipity we often encountered during the course of this trip. So we went over, and the guy immediately pulled out his keys and opened it up. And we saw this relatively new baptismal font in the front, and we thought, this can't be the one that Steve Glowacki was baptized in. And then we went to the back of the church, and there it was. It was the baptismal font from 1945. It still had water in it. It was one of those wonderful, wonderful moments on the trip. So if we think a little bit about the impact of the war on my dad, and that's the kind of thing that my brothers and I talked about as we drove through these different places. What must it have been like for him as a 29-year-old going through this, being in charge of all these people and trying to make sure that not only you seized your objective, but that as many people survived as could possibly happen. So at the beginning, he was uncertain. Later, it was about fighting. Later than that, it was about faith and just hoping that God would take care of them. And he ended up looking forward to the future. Eventually, he started talking about what he was going to do after the war. And this looking forward to the future was something that was really important for him through this baptism. So at my father's funeral, I promised I would show this. This was May 44. This was May 45. So 1 year difference. Do you see the difference? There's someone who's had the experience of war in that 1 year. And this was the route that they took up and through. We found that at Normandy. That was on the wall at Normandy. So at my father's funeral on May 7th, 2000, a 56-year-old man stood up and offered a eulogy. "Good evening," he said. "I would like to tell you a story." And he proceeded to talk about a conscripted laborer, a mess sergeant who knew a smattering of Polish, a company commander who organized a baptism. And the speaker closed with this: "Today marks exactly 55 years, May 7th, 1945, since Gene first became a godfather. The Polish man has since died, about 4 years now. I can't help but feel that over these past few days, there's been a joyous, if not raucous, reunion between two very old and dear friends. One, a former Army first lieutenant, and the other, a Polish immigrant. In closing," he continued, "I would like to extend a wish to the Hammond children and grandchildren. I wish you the gifts of strength of character, of integrity, of loyalty, courage, kindness, of personal commitment, and of honor. All of these were the hallmarks of your father, of your grandfather." And he paused and continued, "Of my godfather." And he's right here. So that's the story I wanted to tell you. But I'd like to open it to any questions that people have. There was lots of the trip that I didn't include in the talk, just because I wanted the talk to be compact. But does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Jim.
What did you find out about yourself?
So that was an interesting part of it as well, because we talked a lot about what it was like to grow up in the family, and I realized that as a child, And maybe this is what children just don't do. But I wasn't really curious about my parents and their life as people. Certainly as mom and dad, but not as their life as people. So when my dad talked about the war, they were all stories, and we listened to the stories when they came. And usually they were the funny parts of what war was. Like he used to talk about one guy who used to go after branches and put them in front of his face and said, "Look, Lieutenant, I'm a camouflage." So he would tell stories like that. But I realized that it really is valuable to keep asking people questions. Your parents, your friends, find out about their lives, find out about the depth of their lives, not just the did you go to Piggly Wiggly today, right? Find out what is it that moves them. And that was important. I would pepper my brothers with questions as we drove along to see what kind of answers they would have. And so one of the questions I asked was, if you took a look at this whole trip, could you encapsulate it in one word? And my brother George said, brotherly. And my brother Gene said togetherness. And I don't remember what I said. I don't remember what I said, but I came up with a one-word answer. Maybe compassion, something like that. Yeah.
Were there any letters that your mother wrote to your dad that are still around?
Yes, but not during the war. So my dad wrote to his mother. He had not met my mother yet until he came back from the war.
Oh, okay.
So they didn't get married till after the war. And they had 12 children after the war, one at a time.
But were there any letters, I'm sorry, from his mom to him?
No, we didn't find any letters back to him. And I suspect she wrote all the time to all her sons. But we didn't. Do you know of any, Carol?
No.
Yeah.
I can't imagine carrying too much around with you.
No, right. But that was important. And I know that there was some communication because my dad would write in letters, we're really not getting enough candy. We get one candy bar a week, and so if you want to send anything, that would be nice. And he would send things home. I know that happened too. And he would tell them about things that happened. When they were in North Africa, almost everybody got their wallet stolen. And he had the equivalent of about $8,000 in his wallet, and he had all his military papers. And he said 2 days later, somebody gave it back to him. And he said, that doesn't happen to anybody. So I gave the guy $5, which would have been $87 in equivalent dollars, and thanked him profusely for returning it. And I don't know from the letter whether the person who gave it back was the person who stole it or whether somebody found it and gave it back to him. But he said, he was the only one who got it back.
I just wanted to address that in that article over there on the table from 30 years ago in the Kenosha News about their remembering VE Day. It specifically refers to Grandma Hammond's prolific writing to all of the boys.
Yeah.
So yeah, there were plenty of letters, but it's kind of hard to keep hold of those.
Yeah. They didn't put it online at the time. Yeah, Marcia.
Thank you for the interesting stories. I actually went on a road trip of Germany this summer.
Did you?
I'm from a family with lots and lots of military service, and one of my brothers is still active to this day. So stories like this are really impactful for me, and I think I hear them differently sometimes. Just knowing that I kind of understand, like, maybe what that mom was going through, because I wrote letters like that to my brother several times. He did 2 tours in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a little bit off topic there.
No, it's right on topic. That's exactly what this is for.
It's a small world because we stopped in Kaiserslautern this summer.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, we charged our car in Kaiserslautern because my good friend from high school and her husband were asked to move to Kaiserslautern to work at one of the military
right?
Army, US military base there.
Ramsden?
And so,
Yeah.
so we stayed there for a couple days, and it really, the landscape is very much Wisconsin-like. We felt very at home. The terrain and everything about it just felt so homely.
Homey, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
You can see why so many of the Nordic people and the Germanic people settled here.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this looks familiar. This looks familiar. I mean, my ancestors came from Lower France, which is northern France, Alsace-Lorraine, and Bavaria, southern Germany, and they ended up coming to Detroit and then to Kenosha. Yes.
I'm curious, he was 29
Mhm.
when he enlisted?
Yeah, he was at, he had finished college. He was working out in Colorado, and he was just starting law school. And then the war started in '42, and they all just came back, enlisted, and he enlisted for officer training. Went down to Texas, and then over to Georgia, up through Maryland, and then out of New York.
So he was a few years younger when he enlisted, and then he was 29 when he went over there?
29 when he went over. He was just 2 years younger when he enlisted, so he would have been 27. They did a lot of training before they went over, and apparently it was useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, really valuable.
Did he ever get his law degree after that?
No, no. He came back. He worked in the unemployment office to help returning veterans get jobs. That was a start. And he also kept in touch with the Polish family and was able to get them over here and bring them to Kenosha. And that's why Steve is here now, right? But brought his dad, mom, Bartosz and Stefania over, and there was a job for him and a place to stay. And that was the requirement, that you needed both of those things in order to bring people
And
over.
he was born and raised in Kenosha, and then he went to those places for school?
Yeah, yeah. So my dad, we grew up in the same house my dad grew up in. Yeah. Yes,
Did all your dad's brothers make it back from the war?
all of them,
Wow.
thankfully, yeah. It is a wow, yeah. Yeah, all 5 of them were out there at the same time. Well, he had more siblings, but Norm, I guess, was a little too old to go in, and Larry was too old too. But he came from a family of 11,
Okay.
and then produced his family of 12. And my mom was from a family of 9.
Where was he in that family of 11?
Something like 5. I could count it down, but I think it was what, Larry, Norm.
Larry, Norm, Lucille, Louis, Harriet, Paul, Eugene.
Oh, so he was 7. He was 7. Who's counting? And I'm a math teacher. I'm number 9. I know that. I'm number 9.
No, she was
Bill, when you share stories amongst your siblings, is there much difference of your older siblings' thoughts about your dad and the younger portion?
Not in the fundamentals, that what we saw in Dad was something that we appreciated in terms of his, he was pretty funny, and he loved playing with kids and would, take big groups of kids to the sand dunes, not just us. There'd be kids from, Jim, you probably were part of that too. Just he would take all the kids and just run down the sand dunes with them. So he had that. But in terms of what we knew about him, those things were quite different. I mean, the difference is 20 years between my oldest, 21 years between my oldest sibling and my youngest sibling. And so, I was asked about his time as mayor, for example, and I wasn't born when he started his mayorship. I was born 2 years in. And apparently I was very cooperative because he had a really packed schedule that day. And the only time he had free was from about 3:50 to 4:10, and I was born at 4:02 p.m. and the Kenosha News remarked on this. But yeah, some of the older ones got to, because there were fewer of them, got to go golfing with him at the beginning, and some of the younger ones got that too. The ones in the middle had less of a chance as the whole family grew, and there was just only so many foursomes you could put together. Also, think about maybe a story that you might have that is similar to this. That would be great. Yeah, Carol.
I do remember him saying at one time when he got malaria that it probably saved his life because he was out of the fighting.
Mm.
And there was one of the toughest battles during that time that he was recuperating. Do you know where that would have been?
Yeah, I didn't actually have that. He had malaria? So, yeah, some older siblings know stories that I don't know.
Much older.
Yeah. Steve, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, normally, as a young kid, when you grow up, you look at your dad and it's like he's a tower of power, you know, somebody that you just totally look at as being on a totally different plane. Now, the trips that you made in following your dad's footsteps through Germany, France, must have given you a totally different perspective of your dad than the perspective you had as you were growing up.
Yeah. I think part of it was this sense of, war is glorified in some ways, and he warned in these letters about, be careful, because it's not about glory. I mean, sometimes some wars are necessary, and World War II is often talked about as one of those necessary wars in order to preserve a sense of democracy in the world, and that people were in the war for that purpose as well. But it wasn't until this trip that we started thinking about, just imagine what he had to go through as a young man in order to follow through during this war, endure the day-to-day life of war. And even if he said sometimes it wasn't that bad, sometimes it was really bad, and clearly so. He did, when we were kids, talk about the bullet that grazed his neck. That was from one of the Purple Hearts. And he said, that's the difference. That's the difference between life and death, right there. And I think it gave him a sense of gratitude, which he passed on. That felt very, very lucky to have been able to live this life.
What age was he when he passed, and what did he pass of?
He was 85 years old, officially kidney failure, old age. Yeah. Yeah, he was still at home. He died at home. But he had time, he had a couple weeks. I had seen him maybe 2.5 weeks before he died, and he was, sitting up in the couch, and he had dementia at the time. I do remember this story. I just leaned over to him before I left, and I said, "You have been a great father." I whispered in his ear. And he looked at me startled, and then he looked at my mom and said, "Do we have his address?"
If I may add.
Go ahead, Steve.
Please go ahead.
I just have to say something about the Golakis. Somebody got married. I don't know who got married, but they invited our whole family. Nobody ever invited our whole family. Anyway.
For good reason.
And a forever memory.
Yeah. Was that your?
That would have been my first daughter, Tracy.
Yeah.
Her wedding. Yeah.
Was it in the basement of a church?
Well, no, ma'am. I guess that would not have been my first daughter then.
I can be remembering things incorrectly.
It would have been at in Racine at the big hotel that was at Racine at the time, right by Jack Case High School.
Yeah.
Could have been your wedding.
No, ma'am. What I was going to say was, your dad, yes, he sponsored us to come here to America. What it was after I was baptized and your dad's unit pushed on, for a while there, we lost contact with your dad. And when the American government, and there was an agency called UNRWA, UNRA, it's the United Nations Relief Agency. They would take care of all the DP, displaced people, us. And they'd settle us in housing, and in this case, we were settled in where the German SS had their barracks. That was where we and a bunch of other displaced people were settled into. Somehow, your dad, I don't know how he did this, he found out where we were, and he started contacting us. By that time, he had gone back to the United States already. So anyway, we would send, my dad and I, my dad would send letters to your dad, and we would correspond through letters. And at the time, my mom and dad were thinking of leaving Germany, obviously, and emigrating elsewhere. And at the time, there were several nations that were taking immigrants: England, Australia, Argentina were the big ones, and the United States. The United States was very limited, though. Somehow, my dad, through an interpreter who understood English and Polish, obviously he could write in English, the interpreter would send the letters to your dad, and your dad said, Australia, come to America.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, fine, how? He sponsored us, and at the time, as a sponsor, you had to ensure that the party coming to America had a place to stay, and they had employment. Okay, so your dad got us a berth on an American troop ship that was leaving Bremerhaven, Germany, and going to the United States.
And this was 1949, correct?
Yes, sir, this is
So this is 4 years.
Yes, sir.
4 years it took to
49, correct.
get this done.
And the ship was the SS Marine Marlin. And as I said, it was a troop ship, and your dad got us berth, a cabin on a troop ship. And there were a couple other immigrant families that also were included there. Your dad, what a guy. He got my dad a job working in the mess hall aboard that troop ship.
Oh, really?
So anyway, I remember coming across the Atlantic Ocean, and one of the sailors gave me an orange. I asked him about, what is this? I never saw an orange in my life. And what an experience. Anyway, as we came to America, I do recall that as the troop ship got near to New York, there were several of the fireboats that were brought out, and they were spraying, arcs of water.
In celebration.
Yes, of the American soldiers that were aboard that ship.
Yeah.
First time ever. Forgive me. First time ever I saw the Statue of Liberty. It was early in the morning, and I remember a real green haze. It was just fabulous, So anyway, we landed on Ellis Island. We went through immigration. Your dad had arranged that we get on a train directly to Kenosha. So we did.
Wow.
Wow is right, wow. We stayed with your mom and dad on Sheridan Road and around 75th Street there,
Yeah.
in their house.
Yeah.
We stayed there for like 5 days, and in the meantime, your daddy got us a place to stay. It was a converted school bus. It was on a property, it was beautiful actually. It was on a property right behind 75th Street where there's like a market there.
Pershing Plaza?
Pershing Plaza, yes,
Yeah.
thank you,
Mhm.
thank you. It was a mansion there. I think it was a Demas Mansion.
Mm-hmm.
And the bus was right on the property of that mansion, sir. Oh,
I said, I think that's Edward Bain's house.
Bain, yes, Bain Mansion, thank you. I'm getting names mixed up, I'm 80 years old. Anyway, so
What
anyway,
age were you when you remembered all this, when you came over here?
well,
5?
I was almost 5 years old, 4.
Yeah, that's wild, it's like 5.
And now he lives about 3 miles from this library.
Yeah. Yeah, very close.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so we lived in that bus. Your dad would come over all the time to visit us. What a guy. And he made sure that my dad had a job on, there was a rich man in Kenosha called Fritz Rudy. Now this I remember. He owned a vast amount of property where on 75th Street and Highway 31, there's shopping centers, there's a Menards there, all that stuff. There used to be all farmland. That was Fritz Rudy's farm. It was enormous. My dad got a job through your daddy to be a farmer on that property. So my dad worked there, and again, your dad would always come visit us on the farm there, because we moved to the house on the farm. It was wonderful. But anyway, as my dad got better with English, as mom got better with English, eventually we moved from there to another farm. My dad got a job not only on that farm, but also at Nash. Everybody worked at Nash. And again, your dad. I remember your dad would come out to the farm, and I would see, and I don't remember who your siblings were, but they're just
Me
tiny
neither.
little pumpkins. You'd bring a few of them over, and your mom, Patricia, would come along with them. You know, what a treat, what a lady she was. But I have very fond memories of your family, and without your dad's help, we'd never be here. It's there's that old saying that there are angels among us. Your dad certainly was one.
You can see, Marcia, why I wanted to tell the story here.
Yes.
You know, I've talked about this in New Hampshire a few places, but since he was mayor here and his connections here. Maybe one last question?
What car did your dad have that he would haul? Did he have a truck?
2 cars. No, it was I remember a station wagon, and there were no seatbelt laws. So we would sit in the back, and it was just a metal back to it, and he would purposely go where Penoyer Park is. It was badly paved, and he would purposely go there and speed up. And so we'd hit our heads on the roof and stuff like that. Yeah. All right, Marcia, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. And I'll hang around if anybody has any individual questions.
I just wanted to make a
Yeah.
comment if I
Yeah,
might.
please, Kathy. Yep.
Not to take anything away from
No,
my
no,
family.
please.
But earlier last spring, I took a class through the library on legacy writing. All have a story, maybe
Everybody.
not as wonderful as yours.
Every story is important.
But in my childhood, I grew up my whole life sharing a bedroom with one of my sisters and my grandma, who was an immigrant from Lithuania. Did we ever ask her anything about what it was like there? Nothing. Well, now that I'm a grandma, I'm like, I want my grandkids to know my story. So anyhow, we all have a story. Bombard your grandkids with stories whether they ask you or not, because they're not gonna ask. We have to
Right,
tell them.
right.
Or write it down.
And write them down,
And write
because
it
they
down.
will get curious about them
Right.
eventually.
Yes.
Eventually, but if you've got it written, then they have it.
Thank
All right,
you,
Marcia, thank you.
everyone, again.
Thank you.